It's 11:47 p.m. A man sits on the edge of his bed with his phone in his hand, thumb hovering over a message he has rewritten 4 different ways. Not because he's lying, because he's calculating. Tone, timing, the right amount of interest without looking too available, the right amount of confidence without sounding cold. He stares at the screen, feels his stomach tighten, and suddenly realizes something that changes the way he breathes. He doesn't want to do this anymore. Not because he hates women, not because he's bitter, not because he's done with love, but because the chase, this constant performance, has started to feel like a tax on his mind. A subscription he never agreed to, quietly draining him month after month. So he sets the phone down, and in that moment, nothing explodes. No dramatic exit, no villain arc, just silence. But the silence feels clean. For decades, men were taught that love is something you prove through pursuit. Consistency, sacrifice, bending, adapting, chasing harder when it gets complicated. If it doesn't work, the lesson was always the same. Try more, be more, give more. Then 2026 arrives, and a quieter lesson spreads. Not on billboards, not in speeches, but in small decisions. Fewer texts sent, fewer arguments entered, fewer chances given to dynamics that feel draining. Men didn't stop wanting connection. They stopped wanting to lose themselves to earn it. And once that switch flips, everything changes. Modern dating doesn't always feel like romance. Sometimes it feels like evaluation. Not in an obvious way. No one says, "Welcome, we'll be assessing your performance today." But the vibe is there. You feel it in the pauses, the tests, the shifting goalposts. You plan a date and realise it's not just about picking a place. It's also about reading the invisible room. Is this too casual? Too expensive? Too boring? Too eager? Not eager enough? Then the conversation begins. And suddenly you're not just speaking, you're managing perception. You're measuring every sentence against a potential reaction. Men describe it like walking through a room full of tripwires. You don't even know where the wires are, but you know if you step wrong, you'll spend the next 2 hours explaining yourself. And here's what makes it exhausting. Effort is often expected, but not always acknowledged. You're supposed to initiate, plan, follow up, lead, reassure, be emotionally available, but not needy. Confident, but not arrogant. Direct, but also sensitive. Strong, but also open. Most men aren't unwilling to do these things. The problem is the constant pressure to get it perfect, without any clear standard of what perfect even means. A text message becomes a minefield. A late reply becomes a story. A misunderstood joke becomes a serious conversation. And over time, men start to notice something uncomfortable. They're putting more energy into managing emotional weather than building actual connection. So the question changes. Not, how do I win her over? But why does this feel like work? This shift didn't begin as a rebellion. It began as fatigue, a slow, invisible type of tired that doesn't show up in the gym or at work. It shows up in your patience, your excitement, your willingness to try again. Because when every interaction feels like it has consequences, you start living in a state of low-grade alertness. Not fear, just constant monitoring. Men start to notice the pattern. They give attention, and it becomes the new baseline. They give reassurance, and it becomes expected. They adjust their behaviour, and the adjustment becomes permanent. And if they ever return to their natural pace, if they pull back slightly, if they need quiet, if they stop over-explaining, now it's a problem. Now they're changing. That's when a man realizes this isn't a relationship. It's a system where he's always paying and rarely receiving. And here's the part that hurts most. Many men don't even blame the other person at first. They blame themselves. If I were better at communication, if I were more emotionally intelligent, if I planned more, if I earned her certainty. But eventually, the honest thought arrives. If I have to keep shrinking to fit, what am I actually building? That's the moment he begins to detach. Not dramatically, but strategically. Less explaining, less chasing, less performing. Not as punishment, as protection. Modern dating doesn't always feel like romance. Sometimes it feels like evaluation. Not in an obvious way. No one says, "Welcome, we'll be assessing your performance today." But the vibe is there. You feel it in the pauses, the tests, the shifting goalposts. You plan a date and realize it's not just about picking a place. It's also about reading the invisible room. Is this too casual? Too expensive? Too boring? Too eager? Not eager enough? Then the conversation begins, and suddenly you're not just speaking, you're managing perception. You're measuring every sentence against a potential reaction. Men describe it like walking through a room full of tripwires. You don't even know where the wires are, but you know if you step wrong, you'll spend the next 2 hours explaining yourself. And here's what makes it exhausting. Effort is often expected, but not always acknowledged. You're supposed to initiate, plan, follow up, lead, reassure, be emotionally available, but not needy, confident, but not arrogant, direct, but also sensitive, strong, but also open. Most men aren't unwilling to do these things. The problem is the constant pressure to get it perfect without any clear standard of what perfect even means. A text message becomes a minefield. A late reply becomes a story. A misunderstood joke becomes a serious conversation. And over time, men start to notice something uncomfortable. They're putting more energy into managing emotional weather than building actual connection. So the question changes. Not, how do I win her over? But, why does this feel like work? There's a powerful internal upgrade that happens when a man stops chasing. He stops asking, "Do you like me?" and starts asking, "Do you fit my life?" That is a completely different mindset. Instead of trying to be chosen, he starts choosing. Instead of measuring success by someone's approval, he measures it by his internal state. Do I feel calm around this person? Do I feel respected? Do I feel like myself? Or do I feel like I'm constantly adjusting? Alignment becomes the new attraction, not in a manipulative way, not as a strategy, but as a standard. Because once a man experiences the peace that comes from not performing, it becomes almost impossible to go back. He realizes something most people learn too late. Love that costs your dignity isn't love. Connection that costs your nervous system isn't connection. Passion that requires self-abandonment isn't romance, it's addiction. So he starts moving differently. He becomes slower to commit, not because he's afraid, but because he's awake. He becomes calmer, not because he's detached, but because he's grounded. He becomes more selective, not because he's better than anyone, but because he finally understands his limits. And yes, people notice. Not because he's playing games, because he's no longer available for imbalance. Here's the paradox. The less a man tries to prove himself, the more solid he appears. Not because women are wired for mystery, not because of some internet dating tactic, but because stability is rare. A man who isn't desperate for validation sends a signal without speaking. I'm good. I'm not empty. I'm not begging you to fill a hole in my life. That energy is noticeable. It's calm. It doesn't rush. It doesn't negotiate value. And when someone is used to being chased, they can feel the difference immediately when the chase ends. Suddenly they have to engage without the constant stream of reassurance. Suddenly they have to offer something besides expectations. Suddenly the relationship is no longer powered by his anxiety. That can be confusing. It can even feel threatening. But it also reveals something important. When you remove performance, you expose compatibility. If the connection was real, it becomes stronger. If the connection relied on chasing, it collapses. And that collapse isn't a tragedy. It's information. Solitude used to be treated like a punishment. If a man was alone, people assumed something was wrong with him. Like he failed the test. Like no one wanted him. Like he couldn't keep someone. But a different interpretation is spreading. Being alone can be a sign of standards. It can be a sign of recovery. It can be a sign of self-respect. For the men stepping back, solitude becomes a reset. Mornings feel quieter. There's no emotional debt waiting in the inbox. Weekends aren't spent managing someone else's mood. Money isn't being burned to prove effort. Time isn't being traded away to avoid conflict. Instead, life becomes simple in the best way. He builds routines that restore him: training, reading, sleeping properly, working with focus, cooking at home, rebuilding friendships, pursuing real goals. And in the silence, he hears himself again. Not the version of himself that performs, the real one. Solitude becomes a place where a man remembers what he likes, what he values, what he wants his future to look like, without needing someone to approve it. And when a man finally learns to enjoy his own company, he becomes very difficult to manipulate with the threat of leaving, because he's not afraid of quiet anymore. For many men, divorce isn't just heartbreak, it's an identity earthquake. It changes where you live, how you parent, how you spend your time, how you think about trust, and how you define stability. Even if the emotional pain fades, the structural consequences can last for years. Life becomes scheduled, coordinated, negotiated. Some men come out of it realizing something they never knew before. Peace is not guaranteed inside a relationship. Sometimes peace is easier to build alone. After divorce, many men rebuild differently. They don't just look for chemistry, they look for consistency. They don't just look for attraction, they look for emotional safety. They don't just look for love, they look for balance. They stop romanticizing struggle, because they've lived what happens when compromise becomes a one-way street. And this is where the shift becomes permanent. Once a man learns the true cost of entanglement, he doesn't commit again out of pressure. He commits only if the relationship adds to his life instead of consuming it. Zoom out for a second, and you can see the trend clearly. Men who build stable routines and protect their time often report more satisfaction. They're less emotionally reactive, they're more focused, they're less drained. Meanwhile, people who constantly chase validation, likes, attention, reassurance, constant romantic stimulation, often feel more anxious over time. Because when your worth depends on someone else's reaction, you never really rest. For men, independence becomes more than a lifestyle preference. It becomes mental health management, not isolation, not bitterness, just clarity. My nervous system matters, my time matters, my energy matters, my peace is not a luxury. And when enough men start living that way, social expectations start to wobble. The old script, a man must chase to be valuable, stops working. Because men begin to realize, value doesn't come from pursuit, value comes from purpose, discipline, and boundaries. A lot of modern relationship exhaustion doesn't come from hatred or malice. It comes from mismatch. People communicate differently. They interpret silence differently. They process stress differently. They want reassurance in different ways. Many men try to fix problems by offering solutions, structure, and action. Many women, and many men too, want something else: emotional presence, validation, warmth. Neither is wrong, but when two people don't translate for each other, the relationship becomes tiring. A man thinks he's bringing stability. A woman thinks he's being distant. A woman thinks she's expressing feelings. A man feels like he's being judged without a clear fix. So men withdraw, not because they don't care, but because every attempt to help becomes another misunderstanding. This is where stepping back can actually be healthy, because it forces a question that should be asked early. Can we understand each other without someone always losing? If the answer is yes, the relationship grows stronger. If the answer is no, then no amount of chasing will save it, only delay the inevitable. When men collectively step back, it doesn't just affect dating apps and relationships, it changes communities. Men contribute more than money and labor. They contribute structure, mentorship, protection, consistency, and leadership. When they disengage emotionally and socially, a quiet vacuum forms. Younger men watch older men and think, why risk everything for something that might drain me? Why commit if the rules keep changing? Why chase if I can build a peaceful life alone? And again, this isn't laziness, it's risk calculation. But there's a fork in the road here. One path is numb disengagement. I don't care about anything. The other is intentional detachment. I care, but I choose wisely. The second path is the real transformation. Because men who detach intentionally don't become useless to society. They become disciplined, focused, purpose-driven, selective about where they invest. And ironically, those men often end up being the most reliable partners because they don't need love to survive. They choose love when it aligns. That's a completely different foundation. Legacy used to be presented as a checklist. Get married, have kids, buy a house, provide, repeat. But in 2026, more men are asking a deeper question. What am I creating that lasts beyond attention? Instead of pouring their best years into chasing emotional approval, many men are pouring that energy into businesses, skills, art, health, mentorship, community projects, personal mastery. They're realizing something powerful. Validation disappears fast, but contribution compounds. And that shift changes everything. A man who is building something meaningful doesn't chase the same way because he's not trying to fill emptiness. He's trying to protect momentum. He becomes careful with his time because every hour spent in unnecessary drama is an hour stolen from his future. This isn't anti-love, it's pro-purpose. Because when a man has a purpose, his love becomes cleaner, less needy, less performative, more honest. By the time a man reaches his 30s and 40s, something becomes obvious. Time is not unlimited. Energy is not endless. Attention is expensive. That's when solitude stops feeling like lack and starts feeling like leverage. A man who spent years building routines, stacking discipline, and learning emotional control becomes hard to shake. Not because he's cold, because he's anchored. Financial stability often plays into this too, not as a flex, but as freedom. Money becomes less about impressing and more about options. The option to leave unhealthy dynamics, the option to live where he wants, the option to invest in health and growth, the option to choose relationships without desperation. And intimacy changes. It becomes intentional. He doesn't chase sparks that burn his peace. He doesn't confuse chaos with chemistry. He chooses relationships that feel like partnership, not probation. That's the compounding effect. Self-respect becomes a lifestyle, not a slogan. This is the part people miss. Men did not stop wanting love. They did not become heartless. They did not abandon romance. What changed is that they started valuing themselves inside the story. They learned that chasing endlessly doesn't create love. It creates imbalance. They learned that constant sacrifice without reciprocity doesn't create intimacy. It creates resentment. They learned that peace is not something you find after love. It's something love must respect. So men started choosing differently. Not from fear, from wisdom. They began to ask better questions. Does this relationship build me or break me? Do I feel safe being myself here? Is there respect when no one is winning? Is love being offered or demanded? And when the answers aren't right, they don't always argue anymore. They step back. Because solitude isn't scary once you've turned it into a sanctuary. Because silence isn't empty once you've filled it with purpose. Because being alone isn't failure once you've built a life you actually enjoy living. That's the quiet revolution of 2026. Men aren't loving less. They're loving with boundaries, loving with clarity, loving with self-respect. And that's not the end of love. That's the beginning of healthier love, finally.